A valuable handbook, Human Rights in Parliaments, a handbook for members and staff, provides a basic introduction to human rights principles and practices as they apply to the work of parliaments and parliamentarians worldwide. The Executive Director, Foundation for Human Rights Initiative, explains.
The handbook for members of parliament and members of staff on human rights does spell out very important values and principles which are often little known. For example, on page 81 of the book, it talks about the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. In the execution of their work, members of parliament and staff of parliament are enjoined to ensure that in the decisions they make, in the laws that they make, they consider human rights as very important. Knowing the obligation to protect, to respect, and fulfill human rights makes them well positioned to safeguard people from being arbitrarily abused.
Human rights is increasingly an important topic in good governance. It is part and parcel of good governance. Looking at the role of members of parliament from first principles, members of parliament represent the will of the people in our constitution, the Constitution of the Republic of Uganda. Members of parliament, again under Article 79, one of their functions is to promote the good governance of the people of Uganda. There is hardly anything that the Member of Parliament will do that will not touch on the rights of people, right from their function of oversight in terms of checking on the government's actions. How are the people's rights affected? When you go to legislate, every piece of legislation touches on somebody's life, either somebody's life, way of business, where they can go, what they can do, what they cannot do. So it is important for members to know that whenever they legislate, they may affect people's rights, and they need to ask themselves a question: is what I'm doing absolutely necessary? If I'm going to curtail on someone's right, is it justifiable? Okay. Again, our constitution tells us about that whatever is done, if you're going to curtail on anyone's right, it must be something that is demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society. And I think that's why this handbook for members of parliament and staff to do with human rights is critical to the function of a member of parliament. It is an important guide because a lot of documentation on human rights is scattered and in very many volumes of works, of writings. But this book tries to distill it into a one source where a member can always keep this with them as they are performing their function, not only of legislating, but also of oversight. So I would like to recommend very strongly this book for every member of parliament. It's not just for those who are considering legislation, but in your role, whatever role that you're doing, people's rights are affected. And you as their representative, you should always be in position to guide the governance of this country. It goes without saying that as I talk about members of parliament, staff of parliament, their role is to assist members of parliament in performing their functions. And therefore, they need to study critically this book, but it's not a one-off read. You don't just read it one day and put it aside. But it is something that you need to keep constantly looking at.
The Senior Legislative Council, Department of Legal and Legislative Services adds.
Well, as staff of Parliament, one, the principal obligation comes from the Constitution to help Parliament in the efficient discharge of its functions. When we talk about Parliament, that includes the committees. And Parliament is mandated to have these committees by the Constitution for the efficient discharge of its own functions. So as technical staff, the Constitution provides for the clerk to Parliament and other staff. Now, talking about how we could help and how this handbook would come in to help in the area of human rights, yes, we are a staff component of over 300 members, but not even half of us understand what human rights is, where the rights are found. Yes, we've got an elaborate constitution, a big chapter there, but the members of staff, because they are from various academic backgrounds, do not know the human rights components. They do not know what the human rights are. They do not know the human rights tools that can be used in Parliament. And I think this book, or this handbook, would come in handy in highlighting these various aspects. Without a clear understanding of human rights, we cannot be able to support in this scrutiny. So, for the staff of Parliament, having studied this book and having appreciated the tools provided therein, I believe they will be able to support the legislature better, and in turn, we would get better laws.
Program Manager, the Westminster Consortium, explains.
Another strength that I would also allude to about the book is that it offers guidance for staff of Parliament on supporting parliamentary engagement with human rights issues through suggesting sources of information, methods of effective briefing, tools for engaging with civil society in times of public hearings, for example, enhancing public participation as well. It also provides the techniques for enhancing the profile of parliamentary work in the media.
So that is one way through which the handbook can help a member of Parliament and a member of staff to make sure that the decisions, the policies, the legislations that are being formulated are not inconsistent with the human rights principles. On page 90, for example, the handbook provides an important checklist, and I will quickly go through this. Does the law, policy, or practice provide for different rules for different groups or types of people? Does the law, policy, or practice have a greater impact on certain groups of people? If so, has the government provided a reasonable, objective, and legitimate reason to justify any distinction it makes? Is the distinction justifiable in light of the reasons being given? Has the government provided credible evidence to support their reason for distinction and the weight of their justification? And if not, has Parliament asked for further information and supporting evidence?
The Right Honourable Speaker, Parliament of Uganda.
I want to talk about the women of Uganda. I know that many of you represent people in the rural areas. If you were to ask a man, what does your wife do? Most of them will say, my wife does not work. Because she's not in formal employment. But I want to show you someone who does not work with here. This person here is never paid for the work she does. This is the person who is described as she does not work. But you can see she's carrying food on her head. She has just come from the garden, there's a hole in her hand. You can see that she's expecting. You can see that there's another one in her back. But you will also see that her young daughter is running the drudgery. Another laborer is being brought up. You can see the small laborer who is also carrying things on her head, growing up in the same tradition. that her mother has grown up with. So this is the person who does not work. But after doing all this, which is not work, and for which she's not paid, she'll wash the clothes, she'll cook the food, she'll collect the firewood, but she does not work. She'll ensure that the husband is clean. He'll go to with a smart suit to go and play matatu in the training center. He'll come back and eat. The children will go to school, but she does not work. I think these are issues of equity that we need to think about and see how we can support these women.
The handbook is also very helpful in examining in much greater depth the substance of these rights. What does, for example, the right to life mean? It gives you the theoretical underpinning of the right. It gives you references. It gives you cases and makes reference to case studies and even judicial decisions where the matter or the right has been authoritatively determined.
The Director, Human Rights Policy, UK.
The book starts from the start point that Parliament have an essential role to play in that exercise, in making rights real. Parliamentarians, with their three roles as legislature, representative and scrutineer, are uniquely well placed to perform the functions needed to make rights work in practice. There's no point in having a right if it's something that sits on a shelf and doesn't mean anything to anybody. There needs to be functions within domestic law to make that right real. If the law is there but doesn't work, parliamentarians have an essential role in looking to those individuals, bodies and agencies which have a responsibility for making the right work. And at the end of the day, they are answerable to the people for whom those rights exist, their constituents.
The Chairperson, Legal and Parliamentary Affairs Committee, Parliament of Uganda.
Article 19 of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights stipulates: 1. The right of every person to hold opinions without interference. The right permits no restriction and exception. And 2. The right to freedom of expression, including freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds. Paragraph 3 also states that this right carries with it special duties and responsibilities and may only be subject to restrictions that are provided by law and are necessary for respect of the rights and reputation of others and for the protection of national security, public order, or public health or morals. The above provision was interpreted by the UN Human Rights Committee in General Comment number 34, 2011 as follows. Paragraph 3 expressly states that the exercise of the right to freedom of expression carries with it special duties and responsibilities. For this reason, two limitative areas of restrictions on the right are permitted, which may relate either to respect of the rights and reputations of others, or the protection of national security, or public order, or public health, or morals. However, even when a state party imposes restrictions on the existence of freedom of expression, these may not put in jeopardy the rights itself.
So, and there are many other case studies that you can look at. There is one on socio-economic rights, and these are carried from different parliaments all over the world. And page 75, for example, on economic rights, there's a South African case, there's a case from Georgia. I saw one on page 109. Torture, for example, the Ugandan government, or Uganda currently is considering the anti-torture bill, prevention of torture. So there are case studies in here which I think are extremely useful very useful for members of parliament to look at.
I'd like to learn more on how you intend to streamline human rights in the work of every committee.
A number of times we have failed. We have failed in putting or bringing legislation to implement the number of conventions, the number of charters that our partner states, our national governments have subscribed to.
Members should read it. It has guidance, for example, on page 183 on legislative scrutiny, page 182, human rights standards. How is your parliament that you're a member of going to be remembered in terms of human rights?
Parliaments also have a duty, in some cases, to activate the human rights that are protected by constitutions. When you go through constitutions in the region, you are going to see so many provisions where they say you have a right to ABCD. But the next subparagraph or clause provides that Parliament shall adopt a law to ensure the enjoyment of this right.
All this is helpful in determining exactly what instruments, what techniques, what tools are available to a member of parliament to push the human rights agenda forward. This handbook is a very important instrument for anyone who wants to engage in a much deeper understanding and application and investigation of human rights issues that often come before Parliament.
The Chairperson, Legislation and Justice Committee, Parliament of South Sudan.
The handbook, I've gone through it. It is a very informative book. It will certainly help our Parliament in South Sudan legislate on human rights. It has some information that will be required, that we really lacked.
We hope that within the framework of the Westminster Consortium for Human Rights, who authored this handbook, members of parliament and staff will take advantage of this very important instrument in their day-to-day dealings. Even if you have very little time to read extensively the substance of various human rights instruments, general comments and the like, this handbook can actually be very helpful as a quick reference guide for any issue, for any tactic, for any tool, for any understanding of how a right has been interpreted or has been investigated, and you make this available to you in your day-to-day dealings and ensure that human rights becomes a reality in the work of Parliament within the region.
The Governance Officer, the Westminster Consortium, WFD UK office.
We produce this book, Human Rights and Parliament's Handbook for Members and Staff, because human rights is a very, very key issue in development. And it's also really important that people in Parliament are educated on human rights so that they can implement it. Human rights has a lot of developmental implications, and with the MDGs and meeting MDGs, to meet them you need to take into consideration human rights. And so it's really, really important that parliaments are brought to account and parliaments work to kind of protect human rights of the people in terms of reaching the MDGs.
One of the things, in my view, that is always ignored is the golden rule that was taught by our Lord Jesus Christ when he was asked of the 10 commandments, which is the most important. And what he said was that The first one should be that thou shalt love your God with all your strength, with all your spirit, and with all your mind. And the second one is that you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. If you do this, you shall have accommodated all the 10 commandments. The most important thing about human rights is concern about your neighbor.